what I am going to present you in this course is mostly based on the science of positive psychology. And that is why we'll start with the question, what is positive psychology? The definition is that it is a science that revisits the average person with an interest in finding out what works, what is right, and what is improving. It is an approach within psychology that is meant to complement the majority of traditional psychological research that has been done before, which is marked by a focus on clinical settings and a focus on people with mental illnesses. We'll now explore how it is different to what's already out there and why it is needed. First, underlying this new approach is an understanding that happiness is not the negation of unhappiness. Let's look at these two models here, the disease versus the health model, that demonstrates this kind of thinking. Over the last 1.5 decades, it has become very clear that, for example, overcoming depression does not mean that you are happy and flourishing. It takes a different skill set, so to say, to go from -5 to 0, then from 0 to, let's say, +7. The area from -10 to 0 is only half of the story. If we neglect the area from 0 to +10, then we are missing out on much of what makes life most worth living. Positive psychology operates within this health model. It focuses on people's strengths instead of their weaknesses. It focuses on building what is good instead of only overcoming deficiencies. And it tries to find ways to be happier instead of always running away from unhappiness. Please notice that positive psychology does not deny that it's important to study depression and so on. It seeks to complement the focus of traditional psychology. Anger and sadness are important, and there are times in life when we feel unhappy, and that's okay and good. We will come to these topics in a class that's at the end of this course, but for now we focus on the positive side of human life. The second reason why positive psychology is needed is that we have to start learning from the best. Positive psychology, as I just said, looks at the positive side of things, looks at the people who perform best, who are the happiest, the most successful, and so on. Because if we want to know more about what makes life really good, it is not enough to study the average person. Let me give you an example. Marty Seligman, he is one of the pioneers of positive psychology and often referred to as the founding father. Started off his research career studying helplessness. Helplessness is a feeling that we are not in control of what is happening to us, and it's highly correlated with depression. If you feel helpless, if you feel like you can't do anything to improve your life, or that you're just a slave to your circumstances, that's unfortunately a pretty good indicator that you're tending towards depression. So far, so bad. But it turns out that there's a group of people who do not give up, who do not become helpless, even though they are not in control of a situation. There's a group of people who never give up and who won't become depressed, no matter what you do to them. Positive psychology is about studying this group of people, the ones who are doing really well. And then it tries to find out what they do differently and how we all can learn from them. Positive psychology is ultimately concerned with helping people to become the best they are able to become. The third reason is that we need empirical evidence to understand what really works. From this perspective, positive psychology can be contrasted to the self-help movement. The self-help movement is characterized by slogans or book titles like these that you see here. 10 steps on how to be happy, and how to be rich and happy, whatever you want, whenever you want. Or 6 surefire ways to get your smile on. In the self-help movement, you have charismatic speakers and very appealing titles, and of course, very interesting topics. But the problem is that they are very often over-promising and under-delivering. There is no research to question and to prove if it's really working or not. On the other hand, you have academia. It's very rigorous, and you will see these kind of research titles in the references that I provide throughout the course. They are not part of your regular learning experience, but I included them for two reasons. Firstly, because this course is based on scientific research and findings. Hence, I have to provide proof for what I'm saying. And secondly, because I want to give you, those of you who are really interested in research, a chance to learn more about it. But what this course is all about is finding the middle ground. The middle ground between self-help and science. The main question becomes then, how can we apply this research to help us make long-lasting positive change? This middle ground is also what made positive psychology, back when it was taught at Harvard University a few years ago, the most popular course at the university. And nowadays, organizations, consulting companies, governments and schools, all of these are taking on positive psychology. And the reason why is because it works. Because it really works. As you will see throughout this course, if you take the lessons, if you take the research and apply it to your lives. Here's a quick roundup of this lecture. Positive psychology is the science of what makes life good. It looks at what works, what's right, and what's improving. Now let's take a look at what is happiness. Psychologists look at happiness from two different positions. We'll take a closer look to get a better understanding of what we can think about when we think of happiness. But first, I invite you to take a minute before we move on and think about what happiness means to you. Pause the lecture here and just write down what your own definition of happiness is. Welcome back. Keep in mind what you wrote down and maybe contrast it with what I'll tell you now. Happiness is something that has to be defined by everyone individually. That is also why scientists call it subjective well-being. Essentially, you know best how happy you are. That's why I invite you to examine and monitor what works for you, what makes you happier. Throughout this course, I'll present various things that you can do to become happier and more fulfilled. Not every exercise or strategy will work for everybody. Everything I present to you is scientifically researched, but that does not mean that everything works for everybody. Try everything, but acknowledge that there is no panacea that makes everybody lastingly happier. In research, psychologists distinguish roughly between two different understandings of happiness. First, we will look at hedonic happiness. Happiness from this perspective is simply feeling good and being satisfied with one's life. There are three factors which influence it. How satisfied we are with our lives, how often we feel good, and how often we feel bad. So it's about pleasure and satisfaction. But there is a problem. If you could be connected to an experience machine that would keep you in a constant state of cheerful happiness, it will give you a constant feeling of pleasure regardless of what happens in your life. Would you choose to get hooked up? Well, it turns out that for most people, simply feeling good and being satisfied is not enough. It's not the only thing that matters, and that's why there's another complementary definition of happiness. Eudaimonic happiness. It is a concept that is as old as human philosophy and taken from the ancient Greeks. Eudaimonic happiness means the actualization of our human potential, not simply experiencing good feelings. True happiness is living in accordance with one's true nature. It has a much wider definition and encompasses all of these areas. Self-esteem, or having fulfilling relationships, accepting oneself, and mastering one's environment. Achieving, and so this definition of happiness also includes what we think success means to us. Also, having a higher meaning, a higher purpose in our lives. And last but not least, personal growth. There is even more to that. But now look back on your list, or what you wrote before, when you thought about what does happiness mean to you, and maybe rethink it. Maybe you have to refine it. What are your thoughts? Rounding up, happiness can be viewed from two different angles: hedonic happiness and eudaimonic happiness. This understanding provides the basis for this course. Happiness is much more than simply feeling good as often as possible. Nearly all of us buy into what Sonja Lyubomirsky, one of the leading happiness researchers, calls the myths of happiness. Those are beliefs that certain achievements, like getting married or having kids, or getting certain kind of jobs, or making a certain amount of money, will make us forever happy. And that certain failures or adversities, like health problems or not having a life partner or having just little money, will make us forever unhappy. But overwhelming research evidence actually reveals that there is no such magic formula for happiness, and no sure course towards misery. So one such happiness myth is the notion that I will be happy when something happens. Fill in the blank. I'll be happy when I get that promotion, when I have a baby, when I'm rich, or something like that. The myth is not that achieving those dreams won't make us happy. They almost certainly will. The problem is that these achievements, even when initially perfectly satisfying, will not make us intensely happy for the long run. And definitely not as happy as we believe they will. Because when fulfilling these goals doesn't make us happy as we expected, we feel there must be something wrong with us. We feel we must be the only ones to feel this way. But that's actually not the case. Almost everybody falls for one or the other kind of happiness myth. Similarly, the other kind of happiness myth is the belief that I can't be happy when. I can't be happy when something negative happens. For example, when a negative change of fortune befalls us, our reaction is often supersized. We feel that we can never be happy again, that our lives as we know them are over now. That would be, I can't be happy when I don't have a partner, like my partner left me. I will never ever be happy again. Or I can't be happy now that I'm broke. Although it may appear that some of these major challenges will definitely and permanently change our lives, for the better or for worse, it is really our responses to them that govern their repercussions. Indeed, it is our initial reactions that make these turns of events into crisis, in the first place, instead of foreseeable and even ordinary passages of life that they actually are. This may seem a little bit counterintuitive, but it's actually true, and we will explore in a second why our mind is so bad at understanding what makes us happy and what doesn't make us happy, especially when it comes to longer term things. Unfortunately, human beings aren't very accurate in predicting their emotional reactions to future events. And this is what is explained by effective forecasting. So we take action on this belief, explicit or implicit, that one action will lead us to greater happiness, greater rewards than some alternative action. Whether we're trying to decide what to have for breakfast or whether or not to get married, every decision is based on the belief that one choice will probably lead us to feel better than another choice. The problem is that whether we look at minute events such as receiving negative feedback or things that are more important, like the election of the next president, for example, what we find is pretty much the same across the board. People almost always overestimate the intensity and the duration of their future emotional reactions. For instance, when researchers ask to predict how they will feel 2 months after a breakup, people often expect to feel devastated. But when you actually compare them with those who have already gone through a breakup, you find that the effects tend to be milder and wear off much more quickly than people initially predict. So why is that? One of the reasons is a phenomenon that researchers call the Hedonic Treadmill. A major problem with seeking happiness in our external circumstances is that we adjust very rapidly to those circumstances. So if we get a new car, an award, a specific sum of money, for example, when we do reach those goals, we very quickly adapt to these new circumstances. We very quickly find new, greater goals to work towards too. The happiness you expect to last has quickly moved ahead with these new goals and left you behind. We very quickly forget and ignore what we have as our focus continually shifts to those things that we want. Also, because of evolution, we are wired to want more. We are wired to want the things we don't have, because that's what ensures our survival. But nowadays, our survival is not threatened. Nowadays, we care about having happy and fulfilled lives. So for example, if you move to a larger, nicer apartment, for the first week or two, you will probably feel elated. It's great. The bedroom is so spacious, the living room is stylish, and the view is magnificent. But after a few weeks, the novelty begins to wear off, and you begin to become adapted to your new circumstances. The view from your bedroom window no longer makes you smile. You begin to take these things for granted, and you may even begin finding faults with your fantastic view. The place that initially seemed perfect suddenly has areas in need of improvement. If only the shower were a little bit bigger, or the bedroom had another closet, or the balcony would be really nice. Or maybe it's time for a house instead of an apartment, and so on and so on. This concept of adapting to our circumstances is known as the Hedonic Treadmill, a term coined by two famous researchers, and it basically says that the status quo is never enough. We keep running, pursuing things that we think will make us happy, only to find that our level of happiness remains about the same. So does this mean that whatever we do will always go back to base level? A base level that's maybe determined by our genes? No. No, we do have influence on our well-being. But for a very long time, psychologists believe that we always go back to our base levels. So for a very long time, psychologists believe that we actually do not have influence on at least not on our long-term happiness. But as I said, this turned out to be wrong. We actually are able to increase our happiness and our success in the long term. It's just that the strategies that we usually use to do this are flawed. Because beyond having our basic human needs fulfilled, that means having enough food, having a place to live, living in a free society where we're not oppressed. Once these needs are fulfilled, our external circumstances matter surprisingly little. And to demonstrate this, I want to share with you a quote of Diener. He's one of the pioneers of happiness research, researching for more than 30 years now. And he puts this like this. He says, "It appears that the way people perceive the world is much more important to happiness than objective circumstances." This means that happiness has to, up to a certain extent, to be found within ourselves. And what exactly this means, and how we can indeed change, is what we will explore throughout this course. In the last class, we looked at happiness as if it was an end in itself. And indeed, happiness and feeling good is its own purpose. But it is actually also much more than that. Because, as we will see, happiness is an ingredient to success. It's an ingredient to a longer life and to a strong immune system. So in this lecture, we will look at how happiness leads to success and not only the other way around. And we will also look at what kinds of positive emotions there are and how we can bring more of them into our lives. Positive emotions are good for us. They let us live longer and achieve more, they build up our immune system, and they help us being more creative. Positive emotions have the power to literally transform our lives. These claims seem very lurid and too good to be true. But let's just together look at how we know about the positive impact of positive emotions. Some researchers go quite far in order to prove that their theories are right. One of those studies went like this. The researchers invited a few hundred men and women into a hotel for a week. The men and women were infected with a cold virus and held in quarantine for the rest of the week. And what the researchers did then, every day, was to collect the tissues the people used in dedicated baskets and weigh the amount of mucus in them. Well, you can say that these psychologists went out of their way to see what happened. The result of the study was that the people who were happier before the study recovered faster than the others. This is quite bulletproof proof for the power of positive emotions and for the effect of positive emotions on our immune system. Probably the most influential and mind-blowing study that's ever been done demonstrating the power of positive emotions involved nuns. It started about 80 years ago in the 1930s. Back then, a number of nuns were asked to write autobiographical sketches about themselves. That was just before they entered into the convent. And then, about 70 years later, psychologists went back to these diary entries and analyzed them. They wanted to find out if what these 20-year-old nuns wrote in their diaries could predict how the rest of their lives turned out. In particular, they were interested in predictors of longevity. First, they looked at how complex the sentences were, an indicator for their intelligence. They also looked at where the nuns lived. And then they looked at how much they expressed their beliefs in God, measuring their devoutness. It turned out that none of these factors had an impact on how long the nuns went on to live. But there was one factor which did have an impact, a very significant impact. The nuns, whose journal entries had more positive content, lived nearly 10 years longer than the nuns whose entries were more negative or neutral. In particular, the researchers went on and compared the most positive 20% with the most negative 20%. And here's the difference. Here you can see how the researchers compared the happiest and the unhappiest group of the nuns. More than 90% of the happiest group of nuns were still alive at the age of 85. And at the age of 94, more than 50%. If you compare them to the unhappiest group, not even 40% were alive at the age of 85, let alone at the age of 94, when not even 10% made it. Clearly, those nuns who were happiest at the age of 20 were not happier because they knew they would live longer. Their superior health and their longer life could only be a result of their happiness and not the cause. So if you're asked, can it be that being happier adds to the years of your life? then the answer is that it certainly seems so. In addition to improving our health, positive emotions have a significant, very interesting impact on our brain. To understand this, it is helpful to first understand how negative emotions work. The traditional example to understand how negative emotions work is to look at our ancestors in prehistoric times. They felt fear or anger in response to a threat, like a wild animal that was about to attack them. This triggered what we call the fight or flight or freeze response, responsible for our survival at times of danger. In these situations, the brain had only three options to choose from. First, they could fight the animal. And secondly, they could try to run away as fast as possible. And the third, which is not here on the slide because it's much less talked about in research and in general, is that they could pretend to be dead. That would be freezing. So in the face of danger, we respond to threats either by gathering our energy for fight or flight, or by freezing in helplessness, collapsing in the face of an overwhelming situation. Speaking scientifically, those negative emotions limit our thought-action repertoire, meaning emotions like fear and anger close our minds and close our hearts. They limit our brain to only a few possible actions. Positive emotions, however, have a different function. Instead of narrowing down the possibilities available to us, they open our brains and our hearts up to new possibilities. This is explained by a very famous theory called broaden and build theory. Positive emotions broaden our mind. They help us be more creative and think outside the box. We become more open to new experiences. And positive emotions also enable us to zoom out of a particular situation and consider and think of alternative solutions. And even more, positive emotions flood our brain with dopamine and serotonin. Those are chemicals that not only make us feel good, but also make our brain function at higher levels. This is the build part of the theory. Positive emotions help us organize new information and remember old information. They enable us to build new connections in our brain. And then, what this does for us in the long run is to transform us for the better. Positive emotions allow us to discover and build new skills, new friendships, and new knowledge. Here on this slide, you can see an overview of how this process works. At the beginning, we feel positive emotions. Then, what these positive emotions do, they broaden our momentary thought and action repertoires. That means they broaden our brain up to new possibilities, new thoughts, new, more creative ideas. And this builds our personal resources. That builds our friendships, that builds our knowledge, and that builds our skills. And then at the end, this leads to transformation. It transforms people and produces an upward spiral. And this process is responsible for the fact that happiness actually leads to success and is not only an outcome of success. Meaning that the way we look at success usually is kind of flawed because it's not being successful in order to be happy. It's much more being happy and then be successful, because positive emotions have such a powerful impact on us. Feeling good can take various different forms. Up to now, I was always referring to positive emotions in general. But we can get more specific, and that's why Dr. Barbara Fredrickson came up with this list of 10 positive emotions. The first one here is joy. Joy happens in an instant. It's a perfect moment captured when all is just exactly as it should be. Think of a wonderful holiday morning with the family. Think of an unexpected present that makes you feel good, or seeing the first smile on your infant's face. The second one here on the list is pride. Have you ever done something really well that took time and effort? Maybe you reached a goal you never thought you would be able to reach. If so, then pat yourself on the back and be proud of it. Stand back and take a deep breath and let it in, because you earned it. The third one here on this list is interest. Interest is a state that calls our attention to something new that inspires or fascinates us. Like a shiny new toy or something that captures our imagination, interest is alive and it's invigorating. Interest wakes us up and leaves us wanting more. Love encompasses all of those emotions that you see here and is experienced if we share one of these emotions with another person. When we experience love, our bodies are flooded with feel-good hormones that reduce our stress and even lengthen our life. The next on the list is serenity. It's a mellow, relaxed, and sustained version of joy. Serenity is peacefulness and comes on a cloudless day when you realize there's nothing that you have to do. It's indulging in a favorite luxury and being mindful enough to take it in. The next one is inspiration. Inspiration is felt in a moment that touches our heart and nearly takes our breath away. Ask yourself, what are the things in your life that inspire you? Forgiveness is something that is felt if we accept something that another person has done wrong to us. It is the positive emotion that we feel if we forgive another person. Awe is when you feel overwhelmed by greatness. Awe is triggered when we see the vastness of nature or the cosmos. Take a moment to think of if you had a moment of awe lately. Amusement comes up in these delightful surprises that make us laugh. It's those unexpected moments that interrupt our focus and crack us up. Have you had an amusement in your life recently? Barbara Fredrickson says about hope that unlike other emotions that arise out of our comfort and safety, hope springs out of our dire circumstances. Deep within the core of hope is the belief that things can change, that things can get better, and that possibilities exist. Hope sustains us and motivates us to turn things around. Now that we learn about these 10 positive emotions that exist, we will take a closer look at how we can cultivate more of these positive emotions. I'll go over some simple things that you can start engaging in right away. Some of those might seem like common sense, and it's true, they are common sense. But as Voltaire said, common sense is not that common, and we actually tend to forget what is so obvious to us if we really think about it. If we do this regularly, those actions can have a significant impact on our well-being and on our health. The first one of these is a writing exercise, which is about writing about intense positive experiences. It involves thinking about the most wonderful experiences in your life, the happiest moment, the most ecstatic moments, moments of rapture, perhaps being in love, or from listening to music, or suddenly being hit by a book or a painting, or by a song. Choose one of such experiences and write about it. Try to imagine yourself at that very moment, including all the feelings and emotions that are associated with this experience. And then write about this experience. Write about it in as much detail as possible, trying to include the feelings, thoughts, and emotions that were present at this time. Find more clear instructions in the additional resources. The good thing about this exercise is that it has not only been shown to improve your mood, but even to improve your physical health. This next exercise is as simple as it can get. Go outside and enjoy nature. It seemed almost too simple and too obvious for me to mention it, but it's, again, easy to forget. Go outside in good weather, ideally somewhere in nature. Don't underestimate the immense impact that nature can have on our body and on our mind. Science is just beginning to understand it, and research shows that we have an innate connection to nature. One study, for example, found that when you're in a hospital, you recover faster if you can see greenery from your window. Just the simple fact that you can see nature from your window makes you recover faster. And if you just take a few moments to look at the picture on the slides here, you might find that even just seeing those pictures can have a positive effect on our body and our well-being. An impressive amount of research backs up the effectiveness of this next suggestion I'm having for you. If you dedicate 1 day a month to doing random acts of kindness throughout your day, deliberately and consciously, you will see what kind of effect it can have on your well-being. They need not be grand gestures. Simple things like paying for someone's coffee or smiling at everyone you meet. Do what feels authentic and works for you. Kindness is linked to increased feelings of fulfillment and pleasure, and research has shown that it's also good for our heart and can even slow our aging process. And most importantly, it's a wonderful thing to do because it literally multiplies happiness. It does not only affect you, but everybody you are kind to as well. If we really want to make use of this course, we have to understand how we can best change our behavior. Because the goal of this course is to make sustainable long-term change, and not just change for a few days or maybe a few weeks only. In the first part of the lecture, we will answer the question of if it is at all possible to bring about long-term sustainable change, and we will look at the underlying mechanisms there. We will learn about neuroplasticity and how London cab drivers and sea gypsies have transformed, revolutionized our understanding of the brain. By understanding how our brain works, we will see how we can gradually transform it. And then, in the second part of this lecture, we will see that even though change is certainly possible, it is also hard. And that relying solely on willpower is mostly a flawed strategy. The key lies in building positive habits, and we'll spend the rest of the lecture looking at how we can build those habits. It has long been thought that our brain and who we are is fixed after our infancy. That means that no matter what we do, the brain essentially stays the same. You were born with certain types of genes, you maybe had some early childhood experiences that still had an effect on you, but that was it. From then on, you were bound to fluctuate around the same level. You were either introverted or extroverted, you were either a more happy type of person or more melancholic, more unhappy kind of person. Thankfully, this was proven wrong, not too long ago. It is actually quite far from the truth. Well, otherwise, the goal of this course, to create positive long-term change, would be rather cynical. At the end of the last century, scientists started to notice that the brain actually does change. And this ability of the brain to change is what's called neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity stands for the remarkable capacity of the brain to change itself. The brain is actually able to change throughout our lifetime. Even when you're 90 years old, your brain changes. It still forms new connections. One of the famous groundbreaking studies that showed scientists that the brain actually does change throughout life was the London cab driver study. For everybody who has ever been to London, it is quite clear that it's a hard-to-navigate city. London cab drivers famously have to take a navigational test before they are permitted to cab around in London. Every black cab driver in central London has to have what's called the knowledge, a memorized map of the capital, including 25,000 streets and thousands of landmarks. It's a brutal learning process that can take 3 to 4 years to complete with a final test. So when researchers looked at the spatial memory parts in the cab drivers' brains, they found that these parts are significantly larger than the ones of normal people. What this implied was previously unimaginable, that the spatial part of the brain can grow as a result of the many hours studying the map of London. But the brain can do even more. Sea gypsies, for example, are nomadic people who live in a cluster of tropical islands. They spend most of their lives in boats on the open sea, and they can see clearly underwater in great depths because they learn to control the shape of their lenses and the size of their pupils. Most of us normal people can't do that, and pupil adjustment has been considered to be a fixed, innate reflex. However, in a study, Swedish children were able to learn this trick. Their brains responded to the training. This is mind-blowing. Researchers all of a sudden began to realize that our brain is actually much more powerful than we thought for such a long time. It is actually able to change itself constantly. Let's see how the brain works. This is inside our brain. Here we see a picture showing a neuron and its many pathways leading away from it to other neurons. There are about 100 trillion neurons, 100 trillion connections in the brain. Some are thin and some are much thicker. You can also see this in this picture here. And every time we do something or think something, a specific pattern of neuron fires. And every time a specific pattern of neurons fires, the connections grow. A great example to think about it is thinking of a stream. Just like a stream, every time water passes, the stream gets a little bit wider. And the more water passes, meaning the more often a new neural connection is made, the wider the stream grows. When a new connection is created, for example, you learn how to play an instrument, the connection is very weak. It takes time to move the right fingers and it requires you to consciously control the movements. But as you keep practicing, the neural pathways strengthen. Like a stream that grows, our neural pathway grows. And the more often you practice, the better you get. And the neural pathways turn from a stream to a river. Unfortunately, the same is true if we stop practicing. Let's say I ignore my instrument for a year. Some of the neural pathways will have grown thinner. Just like a river that lacks water, the pathways weaken again. New pathways or connections in our brain can be created at any point in our lives. It doesn't matter if we're 5 years old or if we're 90 years old. Neurons develop and grow throughout our lives. So since those early studies that I told you about before, other researchers have found numerous ways how we can rewire our brains to be more positive, productive, resilient, and so on. So if our thoughts, daily activities, and behaviors can change the brain, the great question becomes not if, but how change is possible. That's what we are going to explore now. So change is indeed possible. The question is how. Change is possible, but long-term change is hard. And in order to set the stage, I want to share this quote with you. It's a quote by Martin Seligman, who is the founder of the positive psychology movement and one of the most eminent psychologists at this time. And he says that the belief that we can rely on shortcuts to gratification and bypass the exercise of personal strengths and virtues is folly. It leads to legions of humanity who are depressed in the middle of great wealth and are starving to death spiritually. I shared this quote with you to once again emphasize how important it is to not only watch the video lectures, but also engage in the additional materials, because change is hard. The theme of this lecture is how to change, and this is what we are going to turn to now. One way to change is to rely on our willpower. But let me tell you a short story about willpower. A famous study done by Roy Baumeister instructed college students not to eat anything for a few hours and then come into an experiment. When the students arrived, they were given 2 plates, one full of cookies and another one with radishes. But then the researchers divided the students into 2 groups. One of the groups were told they could eat of whatever plate they wanted. The other group, however, was only allowed to eat from the radishes and not from the delicious cookies. After a certain amount of time, like 20 minutes or so, all of the participants were given some allegedly easy puzzles to solve. In truth, those puzzles are of the unsolvable kind. These get used in psychological research relatively often because you can see how long people persist in any specific task. The students in the first group, who were allowed to eat from whatever plate they wanted, persisted significantly longer than the group who had to repress their urge to eat from the delicious cookies. Those students had already used all their willpower to resist eating the cookies. They had less left to persist at the given task. Even though those 2 tasks, resisting cookies and solving puzzles, may seem unrelated, they both draw from the same easily depletable reservoir of energy. Because this reservoir of energy is what our willpower is all about. Lur and Schwartz say that the limitation of conscious will and discipline are rooted in the fact that every demand on our self-control all draw on the same small, easily depleted reservoir of energy. What we learn from this is that relying on our willpower alone to make changes is not ideal. We need something else. Habits. In fact, we need lasting habits. The good news is that those people who really manage to make long-lasting change do not simply have higher willpower. In contrast, the people who really make it might not have strong willpower at all, but they understand that the key to implementing change is building lasting habits. A growing body of research suggests that as little as 5% of our behavior is consciously regulated. That means that we are creatures of habit. As much as 95% of what we do occurs automatically, without us even thinking about it. Most of us already have many habits in place, often outside our conscious awareness. These may range from brushing our teeth every morning and evening to planning for our day, or routines with the family and friends like eating together. We all also have some habits that are good and others that are bad for us. So what we want to build is some new good habits, and we might even get rid of some of the old habits that haven't served us well. So how then do we build new habits? Keep in mind these 4 key elements. We need specific behavior and time. We need one change at a time. We want to lower our activation energy. We want to keep the why, our reasons in mind. We'll look at them in more detail now. In the resources, you can find a worksheet, a template for an action plan to create effective change. It's a tool to put into action those 4 elements in a systematic manner. The first of those points were specific timing and precise behavior. That means if we want to build a new habit, we have to say very precisely when and what we want to do. To illustrate the importance of specifying what, when, and where we want to implement a new behavior, we'll take another look at research. In a study to increase compliance in a fitness program for non-exercising college students, researchers went and wanted college students who did not do any sports to participate in the fitness program. Their first attempt was to give them data about how exercise would significantly reduce their risk to all kinds of diseases. The participation in the program increased from 29 to 39%. But when this information was followed by a request that the students write down specifically when and where they intend to exercise, compliance went up to 91%. Similar results have been found for eating habit, instituting meditation practice, or other healthy behaviors. Change requires us to move beyond our comfort zone, and that's why it's best initiated in small, manageable doses, one change at a time. Why? Because it takes a lot of self-discipline, willpower, to start a new habit, and we don't have much of that, as we just discussed. The problem is that we often take on too much too quickly. So that's why I ask you to focus on one significant change at a time, 2 at maximum. But more than that is too much. And how long does it take to change a habit? We usually hear numbers like 3 weeks or 30 days. But it's not as clear, and research claims that habits need up to 200 days to form. Also, it depends on what habit you want to change. But what is important is that it takes a considerable amount of time and commitment, but it can have a life-changing effect in the long term. Remember neuroplasticity? Habits are those pathways. They are like a stream, growing into a river, but it takes time. Just as water takes time to broaden and widen its pathways, our brain needs time to broaden its own connections. So give yourself at least 30 days to build a new habit before taking on a new project. It takes this much time for the neural pathways to form in your brain. And again, focus on 1 or max 2 habits at a time. If you try to tackle all the changes that are proposed to you throughout this course at once, you will end up doing none of them. As sure as night follows day, you're going to end up without any positive change, and probably also frustrated. That's why incremental change is better than ambitious failure. Success feeds on itself. The third trick to build habits effectively is to lower the activation energy needed. Let's take a closer look at that. Have you ever thought about why we so often avoid doing things that we know are good for us? Like eating more vegetables, doing more sports, something of this kind. Just like water takes the path of least resistance, also the neurons in our brain take the path of least resistance. We take the path of least resistance. And in order to overcome this resistance, we need what is called activation energy. In physics, activation energy is the initial energy that's needed to start a reaction. Similarly, activation energy is needed for us to resist succumbing to our old habits and start new, more positive and productive ones. So if we want to create new habits, let's lower the activation energy for habits that we want to adopt and raise it for those habits that we don't want to or that we want to avoid. Let me give you an example. Let's say you want to start writing a journal every night. Put a journal or a piece of paper and a pen right on your bedside table. If you want to eat more healthily, prepare healthy snacks in advance, so you just have to take them out, just like you have to take out a Snickers out of the cupboard if you want to. If eating healthily is as easy and effortless as eating a chocolate bar, you are much more likely to change your eating habits. And these are just a few simple ideas, but be creative about whatever change you want to make. How can you make it easier for us to stick to new good habits? That's the question. The fourth way to ensure that your habits are effective and that they work is to keep your why in mind. This why refers to the purpose, the reasons why you're doing something. Having a purpose and understanding why you're doing something is a powerful source to drive you. And the most powerful sources of purpose are positive rather than negative. A negative source of purpose is defensive and deficit-based. This means it's based on a threat, on a physical or psychological threat. When we feel our security or our survival at stake, emotions such as fear, anger, and even hatred can be a powerful source of energy. The problem is the cost. Negative emotions drain our energy and prompt the release of hormones that are toxic to our systems if they remain for a longer time. Purpose fueled by the feeling of deficit, also narrows our attention and limits our possibilities. By contrast, when we are able to move from the inner experience of threat to one of a challenge, we introduce a whole new range of possibilities in our lives. Rather than reacting to fear, we can focus on what is really meaningful and precious to us. I want to refer you again to the Broadband build theory, where we talked about how positive emotions broaden our mind and build our resources. Very often, having a positive or a negative purpose is simply about how we frame our goals. For example, are we working out to avoid becoming unattractive and overweight? Or do we do it because we strive to be fit and healthy? To be more able to do other tasks or to work towards a sports competition? The difference in our attitudes can be huge simply by having a positive purpose. In addition to a positive purpose, we also want to have an intrinsic purpose. The difference between intrinsic and extrinsic purpose is just as huge as the difference between positive and negative purpose. Are we doing what we do in order to please others, or in order to get something that we feel we don't have enough of, like money or power or social status, or maybe even love? Or do we do these things because we ourselves feel that they are valuable? Clarifying purpose takes time. Quiet, uninterrupted time, which is something that many of us feel we simply don't have anymore. But if we want to live a fulfilled life that's devoted to things that really matter to us deep down, we have to realize that the only way is to spend time now on questions of meaning and purpose. And for this, I want to present you a wonderful way to connect to our deepest values and our life goals. It's about finding your legacy. You have more detailed instructions in your additional materials, but I will still go over them now because it's so important. Unfortunately, it is easy to lose sight of the things that are most important to us. It seems crazy, but it's true. How often do we overreact to a family member, get angry at someone we love, or lie to somebody we really care about? There are numerous other examples, and the answers are different for every one of us. But what is true for everybody is that we tend to forget about the things that we value most. That's why the following exercise is so powerful. This is an exercise to get you in touch with the things that really matter to us, to get in touch with our true self, our values, beliefs, and aspirations. For this exercise, I recommend you take at least an hour without interruptions and any distractions. Find it in the resources. One last thought. I encourage you to try journaling on a regular basis, even outside of this course. Journaling has been found to be really beneficial for many people. On the other hand, it is a great tool to document our change efforts and help us keep track of them. And it has even more benefits. For example, it helps us deal with negative emotions or traumatic experiences. Having said this, of course it's not for everybody. Some people simply do not like to write, and that's okay too. If so, you might want to try speaking into a voice recorder, or even better, to a friend.